Everyone in the house froze when a father, busy with home repairs, accidentally stumbled upon strange black cables hidden in the wall. He thought they were just old wires, but where they led shocked his entire family to the core. Subscribe to the channel, share this video with your friends, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. When Derek Williams first stood on the cracked front walk of the house that was now his, the late afternoon light was falling in wide golden bands across the brick walls, catching the chipped paint of the shutters and the warped line of the roof. He had not been here in many years, not since his brother Leonard had been alive. Now Leonard was gone, his sudden death still lingering in the silence of family conversations, and Derek had been left the house as his inheritance. For most men, it might have been little more than a burden, a crumbling mid-century structure too old to be modern and too young to be historic. But to Derek, who had spent his life drifting from rented apartments and base housing during his years in the Army, the house represented permanence, a chance to root his family in something solid and enduring. He was 45 years old, broad-shouldered and weathered from service, his hands marked with the deep lines of hard work. His life after leaving the military had been defined by practicality, a job in plant security at a local manufacturing company, a steady schedule, and the pride of providing for his wife and children. Yet, even with that stability, there had always been an emptiness in renting homes that never truly belonged to them. There had always been the awareness that someone else's name was on the deed, that one day a letter could arrive raising the rent or ending the lease. Inheriting this house changed everything. It wasn't just property, it was legacy, family, and the chance to plant roots deep enough that his children might grow without fear of displacement. His wife, Marcia, stood beside him that day, her hands resting lightly on the shoulders of their youngest, Malcolm, who was only 7 and stared up at the towering house with wide eyes. Their teenage daughter, Alicia, leaned against the railing, already sketching the yard in her notebook, while the eldest, 17-year-old Jaden, looked at the building with a smirk that was half amusement and half judgment. To him, everything old was broken, and everything broken was a chance to sneer. Derek let the boy's attitude slide. He had been that age once, too, full of restless energy and suspicion of everything handed down by adults. Inside, the house carried the scent of dust and time. The hardwood floors groaned beneath their steps. The wallpaper in the hallway peeled in curling strips, revealing layers of faded patterns from decades past. Windows rattled loosely in their frames. Yet, beneath the decay, there was strength. The walls were thick, the beams solid, and the craftsmanship was from a time when people built not for profit but for permanence. Derek's trained eyes saw more than the flaws. He saw the endurance. Still, there was something else, something harder to define. The rooms felt heavy, as if the very air carried a weight that pressed on the shoulders. The corridors seemed narrower than they should have been, the ceilings slightly lower, and the silence inside was dense, unbroken even by the laughter of children exploring their new rooms. When Derek laid his hand on the wall in the living room, he expected the familiar hollowness of plaster, but what he felt was resistance, as if the wall were thicker than it ought to be. He told himself it was simply the way the house had been built, but the impression stayed with him. Leonard had been a strange man, secretive and quiet. In childhood, he had been the older brother who always demanded silence when working on projects behind closed doors. As an adult, he had become even more withdrawn, rarely inviting anyone inside his home and avoiding long conversations even with family. Derek had respected his privacy, but now, walking through these halls, he felt that same old sense of being unwelcome in the spaces that were technically his. He tried to push the thought aside, reminding himself that this was his house now, his children's future. Whatever shadows lingered here belonged to the past. The family spent their first weeks settling in, unpacking boxes, cleaning rooms, and patching small repairs. Marcia brought life to the kitchen with her laughter and the smell of food simmering on the stove, her presence pushing back against the gloom of the old structure. The children carved out their own corners. Jaden plastered his walls with posters of musicians. Alicia lined hers with books and sketches, and Malcolm filled his room with toys that scattered across the floor like bright islands of color. Slowly, the house began to echo with familiar sounds, footsteps, arguments, and laughter. Yet Derek never quite shook the awareness of its strangeness. At night, when the house settled into silence, he sometimes woke to the creak of boards or the faintest sound of shifting air through the vents. Every old house had noises, he told himself, but these felt purposeful, as though the house itself was alive in ways he couldn't explain. What weighed on him most were the walls of the living room. They seemed too solid, too impenetrable. On one Sunday afternoon, as the family gathered for dinner after church, Derek mentioned offhandedly that he might redo the paneling in there, give it a new look. Marcia welcomed the idea, saying that fresh paint and new trim would brighten the room. The children groaned at the thought of more chores, but Derek only smiled. For him, it was not just about cosmetic changes. He wanted to understand the structure of the house, to bring light into corners that felt too dark, to make the place truly his. As the weeks turned into months, Derek continued to notice things that didn't fit. When he hung a picture frame in the hallway, the drill bit hit resistance far sooner than he expected, as if there was more behind the plaster than just empty space. In the attic, he found unusual reinforcement beams that did not match the blueprints he later dug out from city records. The house was supposed to be ordinary, but every detail seemed to whisper otherwise. He said nothing to Marcia, not wanting to burden her with concerns that might only be the result of his overactive imagination. Yet the unease grew. One evening, after returning from work later than usual, Derek sat in the dim light of the living room, staring at the walls. Malcolm was asleep upstairs, Alicia was finishing homework at the dining table, and Jaden had shut himself away with music blaring through his headphones. The house was quiet enough that Derek could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. He tapped his knuckles against the wall beside him. The sound was not the hollow knock of drywall. It was dense, muffled, almost as if something lay behind it. He pressed his palm against the surface, frowning. He couldn't shake the thought that the walls were thicker than they had any right to be. By the end of the first year in the house, Derek's sense of pride in owning it had blended with a gnawing curiosity. The exterior repairs were nearly finished. He had replaced a section of the roof, repainted the shutters, and mended the sagging porch railings. But the inside, especially the living room, still bothered him. The faded paneling, the strange heaviness, the way the walls seemed to press in. He told himself that once he found time, he would strip the walls down and rebuild them. Not just for appearance, but to put his mind at ease. That time came in the summer, when the children were out of school, and Marcia spent her days planning lessons for the next year. Derek took vacation days from work, determined to dedicate them to a proper renovation. He had always believed that building and repairing things was a way of claiming ownership, of shaping a space into something truly yours. With a hammer in one hand and determination in his chest, He decided that the first blow to those living room walls would mark the beginning of a new chapter for his family. He would rebuild the heart of their home, strip away the old layers, and leave behind the shadows of Leonard's strange legacy. Yet, as he stood there in the quiet of that room, studying the wall before him, he felt the same unease he had felt since the beginning. Something lay hidden in this house, something his brother had either concealed or ignored. The walls seemed to hold their breath, waiting. Derek squared his shoulders, gripped the hammer tighter, and promised himself that whatever he found behind the paneling, he would face it. For the house was his now, and no secret, no shadow of the past, would take that away from him. It was a promise made in confidence, yet one that would soon be tested in ways he could never have imagined. The summer light filtered through the dusty curtains of the living room as Derek stood with his tools arrayed at his feet, the scent of sawdust and sweat mingling with the stale air of the old house. For weeks he had been talking about this moment, but now that he was finally ready to begin tearing into the walls, he felt a hesitation that he could not explain. His promise to himself had been clear. He would strip away the old layers of paneling and plaster, rebuild the room from the inside out, and, in doing so, claim the house completely as his. Yet, as he stared at the faded boards and ran his hand along the rough grain, he felt a weight, as though the house itself were bracing against him. He had lived long enough with suspicion. The time for wondering was over. He raised the hammer and struck. The sound reverberated through the room, loud and jarring, shaking dust from the ceiling and sending echoes up the staircase. The children, startled by the noise, came running. Malcolm peeked from the top of the stairs, eyes wide, while Alicia leaned against the banister with her ever-present notebook in hand. Jaden appeared in the doorway with his headphones slung around his neck, smirking as if waiting to mock whatever his father was doing. "It's just the start of the project," Derek told them, voice calm though his heart was racing. "We'll be rebuilding this whole wall. Go on, I'll call if I need a hand." The children drifted away reluctantly, leaving him alone with the wall. He struck again, harder this time, and the panel splintered under his swing. A jagged crack split the surface, revealing darkness within. He pulled the pieces aside with gloved hands, the sound of tearing wood echoing unnaturally loud in the silence of the house. Behind the paneling, he expected to see studs, perhaps some old insulation, nothing more. What he uncovered instead made him pause. There was a cable, thick, black, and smooth, running vertically through the wall like a vein of rubber and steel. For a moment, his mind insisted it must be ordinary wiring. Old houses were full of surprises after all, but as he brushed away the dust and leaned closer, the details unsettled him. The cable was too large for standard electrical work, its casing too heavy and industrial. It was not the brittle, fraying copper wiring he had encountered in other old homes. This looked newer, sturdier, and deliberately hidden. He traced it with his fingers, following its path upward until it disappeared into the shadows above the studs. His hand lingered on its surface, sticky with age and heat, and he felt a faint resistance, as though the cable had been sealed against tampering. The logical part of him wanted to dismiss it. Old houses often carried the remnants of earlier renovations. Perhaps Leonard had once experimented with some sort of outdated electrical system, or maybe the cable had been left behind by previous owners. But deep down, Derek knew better. This had the unmistakable look of purpose. Setting the hammer aside, he worked with the crowbar, pulling down more of the paneling until he exposed several feet of the cable. To his surprise, he discovered not one, but two running parallel and bound together with an old metal clasp. He crouched, his breath loud in the confined space, and examined the junction. Whoever had installed this had taken care to organize it. This was not a tangle of abandoned wires. It was precise, engineered. His mind stirred with questions he could not answer. Why would his brother have needed such heavy-duty cables in the living room walls? For what purpose had they been hidden? He tried to recall whether Leonard had ever worked with electronics, but nothing came. Leonard had been secretive, yes, but never a tinkerer, never a man who lost himself in machines. He had been quiet, withdrawn, and almost defensive about his privacy, but never technical. Derek leaned back on his heels, sweat running down his temples despite the stillness of the house. He wanted to keep digging, to uncover every hidden inch, but a sudden voice startled him. Marcia stood in the doorway, her brow furrowed as she wiped her hands on a dish towel. "You've been at it all morning. Come eat something before you fall over," she said gently. He forced a smile, covering his unease. "I'll be there in a bit. Just trying to clear the first section." Her eyes lingered on him, searching for what he did not say, but she let it go, retreating toward the kitchen. He waited until her footsteps faded before turning back to the wall. As the day stretched into afternoon, Derek widened the hole, revealing more of the cables snaking through the structure. The more he uncovered, the more deliberate it seemed. They weren't random, but laid out like a hidden skeleton, running behind the house's skin. He followed one downward until it curved sharply and vanished beneath the floor, then turned to trace another, which branched off behind the opposite wall. The sight made his stomach tighten. The system wasn't confined to this one room. It was everywhere. Dust coated his arms and shirt as he pulled free another length of paneling, the pile of debris growing at his side. Each new stretch of cable he revealed felt like uncovering a secret the house had been keeping for decades. The silence pressed on him, broken only by the scrape of his tools and the occasional thud of falling wood. At times, he swore he could hear a faint vibration beneath his fingers when he touched the cables, though when he pressed harder there was nothing, only the slick surface and the oppressive heat of the room. By late afternoon, the sun had dipped low enough to paint the walls with a warm glow, but Derek felt none of its comfort. He sat back, staring at the black cord stretching into the unseen spaces of his home, and tried to steady his breathing. He had come here to rebuild a wall, to turn an old room into something fresh and bright. Instead, he had stumbled upon something buried, something that belonged less to construction and more to design of a different, more secretive nature. His first instinct was to cover it again, to nail the paneling back in place and pretend he had seen nothing. There was safety in ignorance, but as he sat in the gathering dusk, sweat drying on his skin and dust rising in the air, he knew he could not do it. Too much of his life had been about facing what others avoided. In the army, he had learned that ignoring a problem never made it go away. It only allowed it to grow, and this was no different. He rose slowly, stretching his aching back, and leaned on the hammer. His eyes returned to the cables, glistening faintly in the fading light. They were not ordinary, not forgotten. They were meant to be here, laid with intention, and waiting for someone to find. The first discovery had been made, and with it came a shift inside Derek that he could not reverse. What lay hidden in the walls of this house was not just an oddity of construction or the quirk of an eccentric brother. It was something larger, something he was now entangled in whether he wanted to be or not. As night settled outside and the first stars blinked awake in the sky, Derek gathered his tools and set them aside, but his mind was far from rest. He ate dinner with his family, nodding in the right places, laughing when prompted, but his thoughts never left the cables in the wall. He felt as though he had tugged at the edge of a thread that ran deeper than the house itself, a thread that, if pulled, might unravel far more than he was prepared to face. Lying in bed later, with Marcia's breathing steady beside him and the children asleep upstairs, Derek stared into the darkness. His hand still tingled with the memory of the cable's cold surface. Somewhere in the house, the old beams creaked, and he could not tell if it was the settling of wood or the whisper of something alive within the walls. The promise he had made to himself only days before echoed back at him. He would face whatever he found here. Now, with the first hint of a hidden truth uncovered, that promise no longer felt like resolve. It felt like a weight pressing down on him, binding him to a path that would not allow him to turn back. The house had given up its first secret, but Derek knew it would not be the last. Derek could not get the sight of the cables out of his mind. Even when he tried to focus on the normal rhythm of life inside the house, they lingered in his thoughts like a shadow in the corner of his vision. At the auto plant where he worked security, he found himself staring absently at the rows of machinery, instead of watching the employees pass through the gates. At home, during meals, he sometimes caught himself glancing toward the walls as though expecting them to reveal another secret. He said nothing to Marcia or the children, telling himself it was better to keep their lives undisturbed. Yet the silence was heavy, and it seemed that as soon as he chose not to speak of it, the house itself began to answer in its own unsettling way. It started with small interruptions. One evening, as the family gathered in the living room to watch a movie, the television screen crackled with static. The picture dissolved into black and white noise for several seconds before clearing again. The children groaned, blaming the old house and its wiring, but Derek felt the hair rise on the back of his neck. It wasn't the usual sort of interference. It was sudden, sharp, almost as if something had forced its way into the signal. He leaned forward, staring at the screen even after it had returned to normal, his hands clenched on his knees. Later that week, Alicia complained that the small nightlight in her room flickered constantly. Derek had changed the bulb only days before, but when he checked it again, he found the glow faint and erratic. He replaced the bulb a second time, yet the flickering persisted, pulsing in an odd rhythm that felt more deliberate than random. Alicia, who had inherited her father's sharp instincts, asked if there was something wrong with the electricity in the house. Derek told her it was nothing, just age and poor wiring, but inside he knew that was not the truth. Malcolm added his own observations in his innocent, unfiltered way. He would tell his father that he heard clicking noises when he lay in bed at night, soft and rapid, coming from the vents above his head. "It sounds like somebody's whispering," the boy said one morning at breakfast, his voice serious even as he chewed his cereal. Derek ruffled his hair and assured him that old ducks made all kinds of noises when the house shifted with temperature. But his son's wide eyes lingered on him, as though searching for a reassurance that never quite came. The most unsettling moment came one afternoon when Derek was returning from the store. He stopped to exchange polite words with Mrs. Henderson, the elderly neighbor who lived 2 doors down. She was known in the neighborhood for her gossip and her sharp memory, but even she should not have known the detail she let slip. With a smile, she remarked on how sweet it was that Marcia sang to herself while cooking dinner, something she could not possibly have known unless she had been inside the house. Derek froze, masking his surprise with a polite nod, but his mind raced. How could she have known that? The windows were always closed, and Marcia's voice was soft. He tried to dismiss it as coincidence, but as he walked home carrying the bags in his hands, the thought gnawed at him. It was not only the incidents themselves, but the pattern they formed. Each strange occurrence might have been explained away if taken on its own. Static on the television, flickering lights, creaking vents, nosy neighbors. But together they created a thread too clear to ignore. They tied directly into what he had already uncovered behind the living room wall. The cables were not dead relics of some past experiment. They were alive, present, and reaching into every corner of the house. Derek told himself that he would investigate quietly, without alarming anyone. He rose earlier than usual, slipping from bed before Marcia or the children woke, and went down into the basement with a flashlight in hand. The air was cool and smelled faintly of damp concrete, the kind of earthy smell he had noticed from the first day they moved in. He swept the beam of the flashlight across the walls, the shelves lined with Leonard's old belongings, the jars of rusted screws, the boxes of yellowed papers. At first, he saw nothing unusual, just the same clutter he had grown used to ignoring. But when he knelt down in the far corner and brushed away a pile of cobwebs, his stomach tightened. There, half hidden in the concrete, was a small hole. From it, barely visible in the dim light, protruded the edge of a cable. The discovery hit him with a force that made him sit back on his heels. He ran his fingers over the opening, then moved along the wall until he found another several feet away. This one was slightly larger, its edges worn as though something had rubbed against it over the years. When he leaned close and shone the light into the gap, the familiar black sheath gleamed back at him. The cables didn't end in the living room wall. They passed through the very foundation of the house, disappearing behind the concrete like veins carrying blood. He stood, pressing his ear against the cool surface, half expecting to hear some faint hum of current. But there was only silence. And yet, that silence itself carried a weight that was almost worse than sound. It was not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of something hidden, waiting. His investigation spread from the basement to the upper floors. In the hallway, outside the bedrooms, he dragged a chair beneath a vent, unscrewed the grate, and peered inside. Dust swirled in the beam of his flashlight, and for a moment it seemed empty. But then his light caught on a small metal bracket bolted neatly into the wood. It held nothing now, but its placement made no sense for ordinary ductwork. Derek reached inside, his fingers brushing against the cold metal, and a chill traveled down his spine. This was not accidental. Something had been installed here once. He replaced the grate quickly, his movements more hurried than he intended. In the living room, he crouched behind one of the shelves and felt along the back. His hand stopped on a perfectly cut circular opening, hidden low where no one would see it without looking closely. The precision of the cut was undeniable. It was not the rough work of wear and tear, but the deliberate mark of design. It was the exact size for a cable to pass through. By the time he reached the second floor, Derek's unease had hardened into dread. In Alicia's room, he noticed a patch on the ceiling where the paint was smoother than the rest, as though covering some past alteration. He fetched the ladder from the garage, climbed carefully, and tapped the spot. The hollow sound answered back immediately. Something had been installed there once, then concealed again. As he stood on the ladder, sweat dripping from his brow despite the coolness of the house, memories returned to him. He thought of visiting Leonard as a boy, of being told firmly to stay out of certain rooms. He remembered his brother's sudden appearances in doorways, his sharp eyes warning Derek not to wander. At the time, he had thought it was nothing more than the quirks of a solitary man. But now, with the cables in the walls and the openings hidden in the vents, those memories took on a darker cast. Leonard had not been guarding his privacy. He had been guarding secrets buried within the very bones of the house. When he finally descended from the ladder, his hands trembling slightly, Derek sat for a long while in the kitchen. The hum of the refrigerator filled the silence, but it offered no comfort. The room around him felt changed. Every creak of the floorboards overhead, every draft whispering through the vents, carried meaning. He thought of the cable fragment he had cut earlier, of the multiple strands neatly arranged inside. It had not been crude, but engineered with care. The system was not accidental or forgotten. It was designed, and it had a purpose. That night at dinner, he forced himself to smile, to listen to the chatter of the children and the gentle conversation of Marcia. But the food tasted like dust in his mouth, and his eyes kept drifting toward the ceiling, toward the corners of the room where the shadows seemed too thick. He could not tell them. Not yet. How could he explain that their home might be something else entirely? Something watching, recording. As darkness fell and the children went upstairs, Derek lingered in the living room. He stared at the walls that now felt less like shelter and more like skin stretched tight over hidden organs. The cables beneath his feet, the openings in the vents, the bracket in the ducts, together they painted a picture he did not want to see. The house was not just a home, it was a design, a structure with a second purpose beneath the obvious one. When he finally went to bed, lying awake beside Marcia, the silence pressed down heavier than ever. He stared at the ceiling, his chest tight, and knew that the discovery of the cables had only been the beginning. The troubling signs around him were not isolated incidents. They were signals, each one pointing to something deeper, something darker, waiting within the walls. The house was alive with secrets, and he could no longer convince himself that they were harmless. The night after Derek discovered the openings in the vents and the strange bracket in the ducts, he barely slept. He lay awake, staring at the faint lines of light that crept around the edges of the curtains, his mind replaying the images over and over. The smooth patch of ceiling above Alicia's room, the circular hole hidden behind the shelf, the cold metal of the bracket beneath his fingers. They haunted him, each detail connecting in a pattern he could no longer deny. The house was not just shelter, it was a design, and the design had purpose. By dawn, he had made up his mind. He would return to the basement, where he had seen the cables vanish into the concrete, and follow them until he discovered where they led. The basement greeted him with its usual cool air and faint smell of damp earth, but that morning it felt different, heavier somehow, as though the walls themselves were aware of what he intended. He moved aside boxes stacked with old tools and jars of rusted nails, pushing them away from the far wall. The concrete there was rough, streaked with discoloration from years of leaks and moisture, but Derek's eyes were drawn to the corner where he had already found two small openings. He crouched, running the flashlight beam along the base. There were more than he had realized, tiny holes and cracks, each one a place where the black sheaths emerged and then disappeared again. They were like veins threading through the foundation, silent and patient, converging somewhere deeper. For an hour, he searched the basement walls methodically, pushing aside clutter, tapping with the handle of his hammer, crouching to peer behind shelves. Then, behind a leaning rack of old paint cans and broken jars, he saw something that made his heart stop. The outline was faint, obscured by dust and debris, but when he brushed it clean with his sleeve, the shape became clear. A steel door, set flush into the wall itself. It was small, no larger than a locker, with a rusted handle and hinges almost invisible in the dim light. He stared at it for a long time, his breath shallow. Leonard had never spoken of this, never hinted that such a thing existed in the basement. Derek tried to recall if he had ever seen this section of wall when he was younger, but memory failed him. It had always been a shadowed corner, cluttered with junk, and his brother had been quick to shoo him away whenever he ventured too far. Now he understood why. With trembling hands, he gripped the handle. It resisted at first, the rust biting into his palms, but he pulled harder, bracing his shoulder against the wall. The metal groaned, an ancient protest that echoed through the basement. Finally, with a jolt, the latch gave, and the door creaked open, releasing a breath of air so stale and metallic it made him cough. Inside was not a cavity in the wall, but a narrow chamber, its walls concrete, its floor littered with dust and bits of debris. Derek raised his flashlight and swept the beam across the space. Against the far wall stood a large metal box, square and heavy, its surface speckled with rust but its edges sharp and intact. From every direction cables fed into it, thick black cords converging like rivers meeting at a basin. The sight was mesmerizing and terrifying at once. It was the heart of the hidden system, the place where all the silent veins of the house gathered. Derek stepped closer, his boots scraping the floor. His flashlight trembled slightly in his hand, but he forced himself forward until the beam illuminated the details. The box was bolted shut with thick metal clamps, but along one side a row of tiny lights blinked steadily. Green, red, then green again, pulsing one after another like a heartbeat. The soundless rhythm stole his breath. This was no abandoned relic. It was alive, functioning even now. He crouched, running his fingers along the seams of the box. The metal was cold beneath his skin, vibrating faintly with the hum of something inside. He pressed his ear to it and thought he could hear the whisper of spinning drives, the faint whir of machinery still running after all these years. It was impossible. And yet, here it was. Beside the box, half buried beneath a layer of dust, lay a folder. Derek picked it up with shaking hands, brushing away the grime to reveal yellowed papers inside. He flipped through them under the flashlight's beam. There were diagrams, hand-drawn and labeled with codes he did not understand. Sketches of the house, with lines marked across walls and ceilings, notes scribbled in the margins. He recognized his brother's handwriting, sharp and uneven. The realization turned his stomach. Leonard had known. He had mapped it all, recorded the paths of the cables, the junctions, the rooms where devices had been hidden. He had been part of it. Derek closed the folder and sat back on his heels, the weight of it pressing down on him. His brother's face rose in his memory, stern and secretive, always keeping others at a distance. Had Leonard installed all of this himself? Or had he been working with someone else? The questions swirled, but the sight of the blinking lights pulled him back. Whatever its origin, the system was not just old hardware left to rot. It was awake, still collecting, still storing. His instinct told him to open the box, to pry it apart until he understood what lay within. He fetched a crowbar from the corner and wedged it into the seam, pushing with all his strength. The metal screamed in protest, the echo bouncing through the chamber until finally the lid gave way with a snap. Derek stumbled back, almost dropping the flashlight, then stepped forward again, his breath coming in ragged bursts. Inside, neatly arranged in rows, were hard drives. Dozens of them, their lights flickering faintly, connected by bundles of wires that ran into a central recording unit. It was precise, methodical, and terrifying. Derek reached out, his fingers brushing the smooth casing of one drive, and felt the faint vibration of it spinning. These were not dead machines. They were working right now, storing whatever they had been built to collect. He stared, his mind reeling. Cameras in the vents, holes behind the shelves, patches in the ceilings. All of it made sense now. The house itself had been turned into a surveillance machine, every private moment of his family's life captured and fed into this box beneath the ground. A wave of nausea swept through him. He stumbled back, pressing his hand against the wall to steady himself. His own home, the place where his children laughed, where his wife sang in the kitchen, was not a sanctuary at all. It was a stage, and this machine was the silent witness to it all. He closed the lid roughly, the sound echoing in the chamber, and stepped back into the basement. His flashlight beam darted across the shelves, the concrete, the familiar clutter, but everything looked different now. The house was no longer simply his. It had never been his. It had been built, or at least altered, to serve another purpose entirely. Derek closed the steel door and pushed the shelves back against it, covering the secret as best he could. He carried the folder with him, clutching it tightly as he climbed the stairs. The light of day spilling through the kitchen window seemed almost foreign, too bright for what he had just seen below. He set the folder on the table, staring at it as though it might burn through the wood. When Marcia entered moments later, humming softly as she began preparing lunch, Derek quickly slid the folder beneath a stack of newspapers. She glanced at him, sensing his tension, but said nothing. He forced a smile, kissed her cheek, and muttered something about being tired from the work. But inside, his mind was storming. That night, as he sat in the quiet of the living room while the children played upstairs, Derek retrieved the folder again. He spread the papers across the table, studying the diagrams, the codes, the notes scrawled in Leonard's hand. The more he read, the more unsettled he became. His brother had not merely lived with the system. He had studied it, tracked it, maintained it. Whether willingly or under pressure, Leonard had been its guardian. The revelation cut deeper than any fear of machines. It was betrayal, a twisting of family trust into something hollow. Derek stared at the papers until the words blurred, then pressed his palms against his eyes. The truth was inescapable now. The house was not innocent, and neither was the man who had given it to him. As the hours passed and the house settled into night, Derek sat alone with the folder and the memory of the blinking lights in the chamber below. He knew with certainty that his discovery was only the beginning. The heart of the system had been revealed, but its purpose, its reach, and its masters remained in the shadows. And somewhere in the silence of the walls, he swore he could still feel the cables humming, alive and aware, waiting for him to take the next step. The folder sat on the kitchen table long after midnight, its pages fanned out like a map of hidden corridors Derek had never known existed. He had studied them until his eyes blurred, until the lines of his brother's handwriting seemed to swim on the paper, until exhaustion pressed so heavily on him that he could hardly keep his head upright. And yet, even when he closed his eyes, he saw them still. The diagrams of the house with sharp lines running through walls and ceilings, the coded notations in the margins, the tiny sketches that looked less like repairs and more like instructions. Sleep, when it finally came, was shallow and uneasy. He dreamed of walls pulsing like skin, of wires slithering across the floor like snakes, of blinking lights glowing in the dark like watchful eyes. By morning, the weight of the discovery had not lessened. If anything, it had deepened. He dressed slowly, listening to Marcia bustle about upstairs, the sound of Malcolm's laughter mingling with Alicia's irritated scolding as she tried to finish her homework before school. Jaden stomped down the stairs with his usual impatience, barely glancing at his father before grabbing a slice of toast and heading out the door. It was the rhythm of their lives, ordinary and familiar, and yet Derek sat at the table unable to taste the coffee cooling in front of him. Because he knew something they did not. He knew their lives had been lived under an invisible eye, that the walls around them were not walls at all, but mirrors feeding into something far below. The papers offered no easy answers, only more questions. Some notes were written in Leonard's hand, but others bore neat typewritten lines printed and stapled into the folder. There were acronyms Derek did not recognize, cryptic references to nodes, feeds, and recording units. At first, he thought his brother had simply been cataloging what he found, just as Derek had done in his own mind. But the longer he studied the documents, the more he saw signs of active participation. Leonard had not just discovered the system, he had maintained it. There were logs of dates, careful notations about adjustments made in certain rooms, and remarks about signal stability and line interference. Some entries dated back decades, long before Derek and his family had moved in, suggesting the system had been operating silently for years, perhaps since the Cold War. The thought of it shook him. Leonard, the brother who had once carried him on his shoulders as a child, who had been the stern guardian after their father's death, had kept this secret locked behind the walls of his home. All those years when Derek had visited, sitting awkwardly in the parlor while Leonard watched him with those sharp, measuring eyes, the truth had been pulsing behind the walls and humming beneath their feet. Derek remembered being told to stay out of the basement, to keep to the rooms where he was permitted to never wander. At the time, it had seemed nothing more than the habits of a solitary man who valued his privacy. Now it took on the sheen of menace. Leonard had not been protecting his solitude, he had been protecting the secret life of the house itself. Derek pushed the papers aside and buried his face in his hands. The betrayal cut deeper than the fear. Family was supposed to be trust, especially after a childhood that had left them with so little else. Their parents had worked themselves into early graves, leaving the two brothers to shoulder responsibilities too heavy for their years. Derek had idolized Leonard once, even feared him in that way younger brothers fear an older sibling's authority. That fear had shifted into distance as they aged, Leonard withdrawing further into his silence, Derek finding discipline and direction in the army. And now, after all these years, the inheritance of the house was revealed not as a gift, but as a trap, a legacy of shadows. At work, he found himself distracted, his eyes scanning the gates without focus, his thoughts circling endlessly. Could Leonard have been working with someone? The documents suggested an organization larger than one man, something official. There were references to surveillance protocols, to data retention, words that felt cold and bureaucratic. He thought of his time overseas, of operations whispered about in the barracks, the rumors of intelligence agencies that collected more than anyone wanted to believe. Could Leonard have been part of that? Had his quiet life been nothing more than a front for a duty that never ended? The thought sickened him. He imagined his brother hunched over the very box Derek had pried open, scribbling notes in the margins, adjusting wires, keeping the silent machine alive. Did Leonard ever feel guilt as he watched his own family through hidden eyes? Did he watch Derek himself during those awkward visits, recording even then? Or had the system been left to run automatically, humming along with no need for human intervention? Both answers were equally horrifying. At home that evening, Derek forced himself into routine. He played with Malcolm, listening to the boy chatter about school. He complimented Alicia on her sketches, pretending interest though his mind was elsewhere. He even tried to engage Jaden, though the boy shrugged him off with the impatience of youth. To all of them he appeared weary but steady, the same father they had always known. But beneath the surface, guilt gnawed at him. Every time he looked at their faces, he imagined the hidden eyes that had been watching them for years. Every laugh, every tear, every moment of intimacy stolen by the cables in the walls. Marcia noticed. She always did. Later that night, she sat beside him on the couch, her hand brushing his, her eyes full of quiet concern. "You've been distant," she said softly. "Is something wrong at work?" He forced a smile, shaking his head. "Just tired. Long days." She studied him, clearly unconvinced, but did not press further. Derek felt the lie like a stone in his throat. How could he tell her the truth? How could he tell the woman he loved that the home she filled with laughter and warmth was nothing more than a machine designed to record her every breath? He imagined her horror, the fear in her eyes, the way she would pull the children close as though even the walls could reach for them. He wasn't ready to shatter her world yet. He wasn't ready to admit that their sanctuary was already broken. In the silence of the night, he returned to the folder, turning the pages slowly, searching for anything that might explain why. Why this house? Why his brother? Why their family? Some of the documents hinted at origins, dates from the 1960s, references to government contracts, surveillance initiatives he had only ever heard of in whispers. It was not clear if Leonard had installed the system himself or inherited it from someone else, just as Derek had inherited the house. Perhaps Leonard had moved in and discovered it, just as Derek now had. But the notations in his own handwriting, the careful maintenance logs, suggested complicity. Leonard had not only known, he had cooperated. The thought made Derek's stomach twist. He tried to picture his brother as the man who would agree to such a thing, who would allow the walls of his home to become instruments of intrusion. Perhaps Leonard had believed it necessary, a duty to some shadowed employer, a sacrifice for reasons never explained. Or perhaps he had grown used to it, the way one grows used to a wound until it becomes part of the body. Derek would never know for certain, because Leonard had carried his secrets to the grave. As days passed, the weight of this knowledge grew unbearable. He found himself standing in rooms for long minutes, staring at the ceilings, at the vents, at the corners where shadows collected. The cables had not revealed their full story yet, and the box in the basement still blinked steadily, alive. Every time Derek thought of tearing it all out, smashing it with his tools until it lay in pieces, something held him back. Anger battled with dread, but curiosity whispered louder. What exactly had been recorded? How long had it been stored? And above all, who else knew? The answers, he knew, were locked not only in the machines, but in the choices his brother had made. Leonard's silence during his life now echoed louder than ever. The warnings to stay out of certain rooms, the sharp glances when Derek wandered too close, the locked basement door. They had not been quirks. They had been the measures of a man guarding something he could not share. And now that legacy had fallen to Derek, unasked for, unwanted, but inescapable. On a quiet evening, as the cicadas droned outside and the children laughed faintly from upstairs, Derek sat alone in the kitchen with the folder spread before him. He traced the lines of Leonard's handwriting with his finger, feeling the weight of every letter. His brother's story was written here, not in confessions or explanations, but in diagrams and codes, in secrets left buried within the house. And as Derek studied them, he realized that the past was not done with him. Leonard's silence had ended with his death, but his secrets lived on, pulsing through the walls, humming beneath the floors, blinking in the dark chamber below. Derek closed the folder at last, but the sound of the cables remained in his ears. He could almost hear them now, faint and steady, like the beating of a hidden heart. The days after Derek pieced together the fragments of Leonard's hidden life felt as though a shadow had spread across his world, a shadow that stretched farther than the walls of the house. Before, the danger had seemed confined to the structure itself, to the wires coiled behind plaster and the cameras peering from vents. It had been a secret he could point to, touch with his hands, rage against with the swing of a hammer if he chose. But after reading Leonard's notes, after realizing that his brother had not merely lived alongside the system but kept it alive, Derek began to understand that the menace extended beyond the timber and brick. It belonged to something larger, something faceless and patient, that might still be watching him even now. At first, he told himself it was paranoia. He had been a soldier long enough to recognize the way stress could warp perception, to know that once you believed eyes were on you, you saw them everywhere. And yet the feeling persisted, pricking at the edges of his mind until it bled into every ordinary moment. The first time it happened was on a Wednesday evening as he drove home from the base. The sun was sinking low, painting the streets in amber light when he noticed a black sedan trailing a few car lengths behind him. There was nothing unusual about the car itself. Plenty of commuters owned models like it, but something about the way it kept its distance, never gaining or falling too far back, tightened the muscles in his shoulders. When he slowed, it slowed. When he turned onto the smaller road leading toward his neighborhood, it followed. He told himself it was coincidence, a driver heading the same way. But when he finally pulled into his driveway and sat for a long moment, staring at the rearview mirror, the sedan rolled past without so much as a glance at him, disappearing down the street. The ordinary sound of his children playing inside should have comforted him, but all Derek felt was the quick, uneven beat of his pulse. The next day it happened again. Not the sedan this time, but a tall man in a baseball cap standing at the corner of the grocery store parking lot. The stranger pretended to be scrolling through his phone, but Derek felt the weight of his eyes. For a fraction of a second, their gazes met, and Derek's gut told him it was not chance. He loaded his bags into the truck faster than he ever had before, ignoring the ache in his back, and drove away. In the mirror, the man was still standing there, head bent toward his phone, but his posture was wrong. Too still, too deliberate. By the weekend, Derek had begun to notice more. A woman he had never seen before lingered near the schoolyard fence while Marcia led Malcolm inside for class. Neighbors he had waved to countless times suddenly seemed to turn their heads too quickly when he looked their way, as if they didn't want him to catch them watching. The world had shifted in subtle, unnerving ways, and Derek felt caught in a net he could neither see nor escape. At night, the weight of it grew unbearable. He would lie awake beside Marcia, listening to her breathing, to the faint creak of the old house, to the ticking of the hallway clock. And, beneath it all, he swore he heard something else. The faint click of a shutter, the whisper of a lens turning, as though the house itself had not truly been stripped of its hidden eyes. He had torn out cameras, filled a bag with wires and plastic, but the cables still ran behind the walls. The drives still blinked faintly in the chamber beneath the shed. The system was alive, whether he wanted to admit it or not, and he could not shake the certainty that someone, somewhere, was still watching. He tried to hide his unease from the children, but even they began to sense it. Alicia asked him one evening why he always looked over his shoulder now, her young face caught between concern and irritation. Malcolm grew quieter, watching his father with wide, questioning eyes, while Jaden's usual defiance softened into suspicion, as though he too had noticed something amiss. Marcia's patience began to fray. One night, she pressed him in the kitchen, her voice sharp despite her effort to stay calm. She wanted to know why he was always distracted, why he jumped at shadows, why he had begun checking the locks 3 times before bed. Derek tried to reassure her, mumbling about work stress, about the long hours and difficult cases, but the excuse sounded weak even to him. Marcia studied him for a long moment before turning away, her silence heavier than anger. The guilt of lying to her gnawed at him, but he could not bring himself to speak the full truth. How could he tell her that their home had never been theirs, that every secret of their marriage, every vulnerable moment of their children's lives had been collected and stored? He pictured the fear that would flood her face, the panic that would ripple through the children if they knew. It was his burden to carry, he told himself, until he had answers. And so he carried it alone, even as the paranoia grew sharper. He began to recognize patterns, or what he thought were patterns. The same car parked at different corners of the neighborhood, never close enough to be obvious, but always within sight if he looked carefully. The same stranger crossing paths with him at different places, a face that flickered through the crowd like a ghost. Were they real, or was his mind weaving shapes out of shadows? The more he tried to dismiss it, the more undeniable it seemed. One night, unable to bear the silence of the house, Derek returned to the chamber beneath the shed. The air was thick and stale as always, the flashlight beam slicing through the dust, but he hardly noticed. His eyes were fixed on the box at the far wall, on the faint blinking of the lights that pulsed like a heartbeat. He crouched beside it, tracing the cables with his hand, following them as far as they ran along the walls before vanishing into narrow conduits. The drives hummed faintly, their vibration steady beneath his fingertips. They were still alive, still collecting. And if they were collecting, someone had to be receiving. Frustration boiled in him. He yanked one of the cables free, pulling with all his strength, but the wire resisted as though the house itself clung to it. When it finally snapped loose, Derek stumbled backward, nearly dropping the flashlight. He held the severed length in his hands, its copper strands glinting faintly. But the other lights continued to blink. The system had redundancy. He could not stop it so easily. On the workbench in the shed, the hard drive he had pulled days earlier still sat, its black casing smooth and silent. Derek picked it up now, turning it over in his hands. He had no experience with such machines, no idea how to read what it contained, but he could feel its weight like a confession waiting to be spoken. Inside this box was the truth of what had been taken from them, hours and years of their lives trapped on spinning disks. He imagined plugging it into a computer, watching files unfold, watching images of his children sleeping, his wife laughing, himself sitting unaware at this very table. The thought made his hands tremble. He wanted to know, but he also dreaded the knowledge. Once seen, it could never be unseen. In the following days, the world outside pressed closer. At the auto shop, Derek caught himself staring out the windows more often than at the vehicles before him, his rag still in hand as engines idled on lifts. He noticed unfamiliar faces passing too often, eyes lingering too long. Once, while carrying a box of parts into the back, he thought he heard footsteps behind him, quick and deliberate. But when he turned, the aisle was empty, the door swinging shut in the distance. At home, every small sound became a warning. The hum of the refrigerator seemed louder, the creak of the stairwell sharper, the faint rustle of wind through the trees outside more sinister. He unplugged electronics where he could, taped over cameras on their laptops, closed blinds that had once stood open. Still, it wasn't enough. The house itself was tainted, riddled with veins he could not cut away. Marcia grew more insistent, demanding to know what weighed on him. Derek wanted to tell her then, wanted to pour it all out and collapse into her arms. But fear stopped him cold. Fear of her terror, fear of her disbelief, fear of the truth that once spoken could never be contained again. So he lied once more, murmuring about stress, about work, about the ache in his body that never seemed to leave him. But as he lay beside her that night, staring at the dark ceiling, Derek knew he could not carry it alone forever. The watchers outside, the system inside, the legacy of Leonard's silence, they were closing in. And soon he would be forced to act, whether he was ready or not. The blink of the lights in the chamber beneath the shed haunted him even in dreams. They pulsed like eyes, patient and unblinking, waiting for him to face them. The sleepless nights had become unbearable. Derek no longer marked the hours by the hands of the old clock in the hall, but by the growing weight of his own dread, the way silence thickened until he swore he could hear the walls breathing around him. He had lived for weeks in this tension, balancing lies and half-truths, shielding his family from what he knew, but even his stubbornness had limits. The watchers outside, the blinking lights below, a paranoia that grew sharper with each day, it had built a pressure he could no longer contain. It began, as many final acts do, with the smallest of moments. That evening, Marcia was setting plates on the dinner table while the children argued about television shows. Alicia was drawing in her notebook, Malcolm practicing multiplication out loud, and Jaden scrolling on his phone with the usual teenage detachment. The noise of family life filled the kitchen, ordinary and precious, and yet to Derek it rang false, like actors performing on a stage. He looked at the vent above their heads, at the ceiling light glowing softly, and all he could see was the hidden lenses he had already uncovered, the silent theft of their privacy. His stomach clenched as the realization crashed against him with a force stronger than any denial. His family had never been safe here. Every moment they had believed to be their own had belonged, in truth, to someone else. His fork clattered against the plate as he set it down, too hard. Marcia glanced up at him, her brows knitting, but before she could speak, Derek rose from the table. His hands trembled as he moved to the cabinet where he had hidden one of the severed lenses. He placed it on the table in the center of the room, the small black glass catching the kitchen light. The children fell silent, their arguments fading into confusion. Marcia's hand froze in midair, holding a serving spoon. "What is that?" she asked softly, though her voice carried the edge of fear already. Derek swallowed, his throat dry. "It's a camera," he said, "one of many, hidden in the vents. in the lights, in the walls, watching us. The silence that followed was suffocating. Alicia's pencil rolled from the table to the floor. Malcolm's eyes widened, his lips parting but no sound coming out. Jaden set down his phone slowly, suspicion flashing across his face as though he had always half expected something like this. But it was Marcia's reaction that broke Derek's heart. She pressed her hand to her mouth, her eyes filling with tears that she fought to contain. She looked at him with a mixture of horror and betrayal, as though he had not only delivered the news but created it. "For how long?" she whispered. Derek lowered his eyes. "Years, decades, since before us, since Leonard." He told them, then, all of it. The cables beneath the steps, the hatch under the shed, the box with its blinking lights, the hard drives stacked like coffins of memory. He spoke of Leonard's notes, of the maintenance logs, of the acronyms and codes that hinted at something far larger than a single man's paranoia. His voice trembled as he admitted he had torn out cameras, destroyed what he could, but that the system still lived in the walls, still pulsed below them in the chamber. Every word seemed to draw the air tighter in the room until it was almost impossible to breathe. Marcia paced the kitchen, her hands shaking. She demanded to know why he had waited so long, why he had lied, why he had let their children sleep under a roof that hid such secrets. Derek tried to explain the fear, the uncertainty, the doubt that had choked him, but his words felt weak even to his own ears. The children watched, bewildered, their innocence collapsing in front of him. Alicia clung to her mother's waist, Malcolm buried his face against her side, and even Jaden, who tried to stay stoic, could not hide the tremor in his hands. The argument rose, fueled by fear. Marcia insisted they call the police, that they could not live another moment in a house wired like a cage. Derek hesitated, his mind running wild with suspicions. What if the system was larger than the police? What if the very people they turned to for help were the ones behind it? His doubts collided with her desperation until he realized there was no choice left. He could not ask his wife and children to endure another night of silence, another day of hidden eyes. Together, they made the call. The response was faster than Derek had expected. Within an hour, red and blue lights painted the street, flashing against the windows. Uniformed officers moved through the yard, radios crackling, their boots heavy against the wooden porch. Neighbors gathered outside, whispering, their faces pale as they watched. To them, the Johnson house had always been ordinary, a piece of the neighborhood's quiet fabric. Now it stood exposed, its secrets bleeding into the night. The officers moved through each room with deliberate efficiency. They unscrewed vents, pried open light fixtures, pulled cables from behind walls. Each time another device was carried out, Derek felt the weight in his chest grow heavier. It wasn't just one or two cameras, it was dozens, hidden with precision, woven into the very structure of the house. The pile of black wires and small lenses in the yard grew higher with each passing minute. And then they moved to the shed, to the hatch Derek had first pried open with his crowbar. He followed them down into the chamber, the beam of their flashlights cutting across the concrete walls. They surrounded the metal box, their gloved hands prying it open, their murmured voices filled with unease. Hard drives were lifted out, tagged, placed carefully into evidence cases. The faint blinking of lights that had haunted Derek for weeks finally dimmed as the power was severed. The hum of the machine died, leaving only silence, but it was not a silence of peace. It was the silence of something immense, finally revealed. One officer, his hair gray at the temples, pulled Derek aside. His eyes were tired but sharp as he explained that the equipment was old but sophisticated. It was more than one man could have installed. It bore the marks of design, of purpose, of institutional knowledge. He admitted it looked like something that had been running for decades, long before Derek inherited the house. They would investigate, he promised, but answers would not come quickly. Whoever had built it had known how to hide. Outside, the spectacle grew. Reporters arrived, their cameras flashing, their questions sharp. Derek stood mute as they fired inquiries at him. How long had it been there? What had been recorded? Who was behind it? He could not answer. All he could say was that he would never look at his home the same way again. By the time the last cruiser drove away, dawn was breaking. The neighbors had retreated to their houses, but Derek could still feel their eyes behind curtains, their whispers carried on the early morning air. He stood in the yard with Marcia and the children, their faces pale, their bodies pressed close together. Michelle clung to Marcia's leg. Daniel tried to stand tall, though his hands shook, and Marcia's grip on Derek's arm was tight, desperate. They watched in silence as the officers carried away the last of the equipment. The house loomed behind them, its windows staring blankly, its walls heavy with the scars of intrusion. It no longer felt like home. It felt hollow, like a stage stripped of its illusions. In the weeks that followed, the investigation dragged on. Officials offered no answers, only reassurances that they were looking into it. But Derek knew better. He had been a soldier long enough to recognize the language of bureaucracy, the way truth was buried under phrases that promised nothing. The house remained, but it was forever changed. Every corner carried memory of violation. Every shadow whispered of secrets. Marcia spoke often of moving, of finding a fresh start somewhere far away. Derek hesitated, torn between his duty to protect his family and the weight of what the house represented. It was his inheritance, his legacy, and abandoning it felt like surrender. Yet staying felt like living inside a wound that would never heal. At night, he lay awake, staring at the ceiling. He thought of Leonard, of the strange man who had guarded this secret for so long, of the life he had lived in silence. He thought of the blinking lights in the box, the drives filled with stolen memories, and he wondered if the true extent of what had been recorded would ever be known. Perhaps the police would find answers. Perhaps the reporters would speculate. But Derek feared the truth was buried deeper than cables and hard drives, deeper than walls and wires. One certainty remained. The innocence of their home was gone. The laughter of his children, the intimacy of his marriage, the quiet prayers whispered in solitude, none of it had belonged to them. It had been stolen by unseen eyes, captured and stored in silence. And though the cameras were gone, though the box beneath the shed had been carried away, Derek knew the memory of those blinking lights would follow him forever. The house stood quiet, but it would never again be home. Don't miss the next shocking story. Hit subscribe right now and turn on the bell so you're always the first to know. Want more chills? Check out the next unbelievable video waiting for you on screen, or dive into our other stories that will leave you speechless. And if this story shook you, share it with your friends and family. Let them discover the terrifying truth too.